Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Science Friday live stream. My name is Diana Plasker. I am the Experiences Manager for Science Friday, joining you from sunny New York State this afternoon. Thank you so much, no matter where you are joining us from. Speaking of which, we want to know, where are you joining us from today? So if you want to go to the chat and let us know, that is a great place to do it. You do have to log in to YouTube to ask questions of our guests today, as well as let us know where you are joining from. So make sure to sign on in and head on over to the chat. We have people joining from New Hampshire, Kansas City, Annapolis, Gloucester, Bozeman, Denver, Irvine. Wow, so many places. Thank you so much for being here. It is so great to see all of those amazing places across the country. Well, if you don't know us, I like to say that Science Friday is your one-stop shop for all things science news. We're well known for our weekly radio show, which broadcasts every week on, you guessed it, every Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern. You can listen to us live on your local radio station or by visiting us at sciencefriday.com. And there's a listen banner usually at the very top of our website when we are live. And all kinds of goodies are on there. We've got educational resources, we've got other events that you can sign up for, and everything you need to know about our book club. Well, today we are here to talk about this month's book club pick, which was and still is A Sand County Almanac and Sketches Here and There by Aldo Leopold, which is celebrating its 75th publication anniversary. That's very exciting. And if you want to join fellow readers to discuss this and our other book picks together, you can head on over to our website, or you can find out more all about our community, which is hosted on Mighty Networks. It's kind of like Facebook groups, but I think better. And I will post a link to that in the chat if you'd like to join us there. I see already a few people from our community joining us in the chat, so thank you all for being here. Well, before we get started, a kind reminder. Science Friday is committed to providing a welcoming and harassment-free environment for members of all ethnicities, ages, gender, and trans statuses, sexual orientations, physical abilities, national origin, beliefs, and any other dimension of diversity. We have created a code of conduct, which you can read in its entirety on our community space that I just mentioned. And it helps us create a safe and positive community experience for all. And I believe that providing clear expectations is a necessary part of building a respectful community. So here are the basics. You can find them in the chat as well. Be supportive and respectful when speaking with one another or asking questions in the chat. Share generously and listen closely. You can add your thoughts whenever you would like, even if they aren't strictly questions for our guests. We're going to do our best to stay on topic because we're here to discuss this month's book club pick and closely related topics. We reserve the right to ban anyone who engages in demeaning, discriminatory, or harassing behavior here today. Well, that is all. Thank you so much for sticking with me. I think it's time for me to introduce our special guest for today's live stream. So please welcome to the stage. We've got Buddy, we've got Roberta, and we have Curt here joining me. Thank you all so much for being here. I am going to introduce them one at a time so you can get to know them all before we start chatting. Curt Meine is a conservation biologist, environmental historian, and writer. He is the author of Aldo Leopold, His Life and Work, the first biography of Leopold, which received a number of awards and was reissued in 2010 after its original publication in 1988. He serves as senior fellow at the Aldo Leopold Foundation in Baraboo, Wisconsin. Curt, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Diana. Look forward to this conversation.
Thanks. Next up, we have Roberta Milstein, who is an Emerit Professor in the Department of Philosophy. Why is it so hard for me to read that word? A Department of Philosophy at UC Davis. Her research focuses on the philosophy of science and the history and philosophy of biology, as well as environmental ethics. Her new book, The Land is Our Community, Aldo Leopold's Environmental Ethic for the New Millennium, was published earlier this year. Thank you so much for being here, Roberta.
Thanks, Diana. Thanks for having me.
And last but certainly not least, Buddy Huffaker is the executive director of the Aldo Leopold Foundation. His academic background is in landscape architecture and plant ecology, and he has helped grow the foundation's reach and impact for the last 25 years. Buddy, thank you so much for being here.
Honor and pleasure to be with you today. Thanks, Diana.
Well, reminder to our audience, we are taking your questions in the chat. So if at any point you have questions available, questions ready, you can put them in the chat and we will answer as many as we possibly can today. A quick question I'll answer really quick. A recording, yes, you can come back to this same link and rewatch this conversation to your heart's content later today. So amazing. Well, Curt, I'm going to start off with you. Can you tell us just a little bit about Aldo Leopold? So we've spent this month reading his works, and who was he? How is he remembered and studied today?
Well, sure. Well, we'll start with where you are starting here, and that is to say that Leopold is probably best known uh, beyond where Buddy and I are in Wisconsin. He's probably best known as the author of a Sand County Almanac, which became such an influential book and has remained an influential book now for 75 years. But behind the author of a Sand County Almanac, who's almost become sort of a mythical figure, is a live human being who had a long, interesting journey in his life that tracks a lot of what happened in the early conservation and environmental movements. So very quickly, he was born in the Midwest in the in 1887, and became one of the first generation of trained American foresters. Spent his early career in the U.S. Forest Service in the brand new states then of New Mexico and Arizona. He ultimately was transferred back to the Midwest, to Madison, Wisconsin, where eventually he joined the faculty at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And he just continually broadened out in his career and his thinking. And this is one of the characteristics of him as a figure. Was he started as a forester, which was kind of the main area you could go into in the early conservation movement, but he was a pioneer in many different fields of conservation and environmental work. So he was early involved in soil conservation. He became maybe the most important founding figure in the new field of wildlife ecology and conservation. He was a teacher and professor at the university and taught many students who went on to storied careers. He was a scientist himself and a researcher, primarily as an ecologist. And all this predates him becoming an author or writer, because in fact, the essays that you and your readers have been taking in really only came later in his career. The first essays that you read in the Sand County Almanac were actually not written until he was 50 years old. But let's end this by saying, among all those other labels, he was also he was a father, and he was a husband. And his wife, Estella Leopold, was obviously a key figure in his own life and development. And their 5 children went on to become prominent scientists, conservationist advocates in their own actually quite remarkable careers.
That's amazing. I love that you sort of gave us the full breadth of who he was, not just in the context of what we were reading, but just in the context of history and ecology and his surroundings. I think that he would be proud of hearing his bio said like that. Can you tell us a little bit? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, in his own original foreword to the book, actually, he wrote that these essays were the end product, as he put it, of a life journey. So when you're reading the book, you're reading not just these kind of essays at the surface level. You're really reading Leopold in the later years of his life, trying to make sense of all that he had seen, observed, and thought over and struggled to understand.
We actually have a really great question from one of our attendees here today. Jean asks, how did the author research his incredible book? It seems like a lot of his research was sort of, self-reflection and just sort of reporting on what he saw and experienced when he was out on the farm, at least the Sand County Almanac section of the book. How else was he sort of finding out the knowledge that he then put into these essays?
Well, he was a sponge. He was always absorbing information in the pre-internet years and before we had all the tools we have now. He was just reading and constantly absorbing the latest interesting information. He also read broadly beyond the sciences in the humanities, history, philosophy. But the most important thing in all of that was he was an extraordinarily meticulous naturalist an observer of the natural world. And so the real raw material, especially of those early essays in the Sand County Almanac, are his own field journals that he kept, gosh, for really more than 30 years from the beginning of his career to the end, literally the day he died. So when you can almost track any one of those essays back to original observations in the field and find the fine notations of that day in 1939 when he saw this in the field. So that was really the primary research.
It's really cool reading back his sort of observations and thinking back to the things that I'm trying to write more, just musings, things that parts of my life, and it gives me you know a lot of pleasure to read someone else's writings that are just their experience and think this might be useful to someone at some point, which would be cool. um, well, Curt, we're going to come back to you, but buddy, I want to ask you a little bit about the Aldo Leopold Foundation. What exactly is the foundation? What is your goal, and sort of what are you working on right now? I know that's a lot of
Yeah,
questions,
well,
but
we're working on all sorts of things, but just to follow up on one thing that Curt mentioned, we have just transcribed all of the shack journals. So from 1935 to 1948, all of the family's observations and activities at the shack. Those journals had been digitized, but now we made them actually searchable by keyword. So that will all get released next month at the Leopold Foundation. So stay tuned. And that's just an example of some of the work that the foundation does. But it was created by the 5 children of Aldo and Estella Leopold. And Curt mentioned how influential they were in their own rights in science and conservation. And so they were kind of uniquely positioned to recognize that their father's writing continued to gain audience and just continue to gain relevance as they went about their own science and conservation careers. And so in 1982, they did the very generous act of literally giving away the farm. They created the foundation and entrusted it with 2 primary assets: their family farm, which is where the shack and all those activities in the first part of the book occurred, that sits along the Wisconsin River, and then also the rights to their father's published and unpublished writings. So the foundation serves as the executor of Aldo Leopold's literary estate. And the book's now been translated into 15 different languages, and we help bring it out into new formats and new packages to continue to, find new readers and inspire old readers. And so our work is still in those 2 kind of portfolios: on the ground, continuing ecological restoration and stewardship work on about 10,000 acres on our property, neighboring properties, state land, federal land, and then ensuring scholars like Roberta have access to resources and are continuing to think about and interpret the Leopold legacy and meaning of a land ethic. So our work is both, we kind of keep our hands in the dirt and our head in the sky, if you will.
I love that. Oh, that's amazing. I love my work. I do wish it was a little bit more hands in the dirt. That sounds like a lot of fun. Um, Roberta, can you tell us a little bit about your book? So it takes a fresh look at Leopold's land ethic, bringing it into today's culture and modern ecological science. Can you tell us a little bit more about sort of how you got to this sort of subject and how Aldo's work has sort of influenced you?
Sure, thanks. I could go on for a long time with that. I'll try not to. First, I just want to say, yes, buddy, the foundation's archives were so helpful to me, and that I could be here in California and access them in Wisconsin was great. So I think, I first started teaching the land ethic. It's a standard part of environmental ethics curriculums. It's in all the textbooks. And so I was teaching it, and the students were excited about it, but the kind of most prevalent interpretation, they weren't really understanding it. They weren't seeing where it was coming from. And so I started to think there's got to be another way to think about it. And it took me a few years, and then it kind of finally came to me, after when you teach something, when you have to explain something again and again, you start to see things in a new way. And so I started to see that there were some kind of key terms that really hadn't been spelled out, like interdependence, land community, land health, even biodiversity, right? And he doesn't use that word, but that's, what he was talking about, right? That he was really kind of very forward thinking in the way he thought about those concepts. And so, philosophers, where I come, the discipline that I was coming from was thinking of him like he was an ethicist, and they were kind of overlooking all of his science. And so he had this really forward-looking science. And as I started to delve into it more and more, I realized, that he kind of, just to take land health is very similar to the ideas of sustainability that we have today. And yet he was seeing that in the early part of the 20th century. So I still think there's some, really important insights that he had, given his, again, hands-on, hands in the dirt approach, right? Where he kind of learned things that worked and things that didn't work. And then, so I tried to give, what I saw as more as better interpretations of what he was up to, and also how he saw the argument for the land ethic, why we should accept it. And I think, again, that's, it's a very kind of straightforward argument. Like, we see ourselves as members of human communities, and we recognize our obligations to human communities. And so, well, what does ecology teach us? Ecology teaches us that we're members of larger communities. We're members of these land communities with plants, animals, soils, and waters. And so we have obligations to them as well, right? And I think it's just a simple, straightforward argument that anyone can kind of say, oh, right, that's right. And then finally in the book, I talk about sort of the policy implications and how you can take these, scientific concepts and this these values that we're talking about and put them into policy.
So, Roberta, you just gave us kind of the broad strokes. What is this land ethic, idea that Leopold was talking about in this book? Curt, I'm wondering if you have a way that when someone says, "What is land ethic?" that you, when you're sort of posed that question, is there a way that you explain it to people?
Yeah, there is. You go right to the pages of
I was hoping you would show us that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just a couple of the key sentences, because the kind of the art of that particular essay is how Leopold collapsed his life experience into a relatively short text, and each sentence is laden with challenging concepts and terms, as Roberta mentioned, with whole histories behind it. And the more you learn of Leopold, the more you learn about the experience behind the prose. So just to choose a couple of the key lines: a land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to plain member and citizen of it. It implies respect for his fellow members and also respect for the community as such. So there are other key passages, but it's this fundamental concept that comes from, in the Western tradition, the science of ecology as it had developed over, at that point, the prior 50 or 60 years. Quick to add, though, that there are resonances with other ways of understanding our human relationships with the world, with indigenous traditions here in this continent, but also around the world, in different religious traditions and so forth. So Leopold was drawing upon the science that he knew best, but he was also recognizing that science doesn't stand alone in society, and Roberta can help us think through that science itself is a product of social interaction and processes. But he, as a conservationist, as just a human, as a caring, thinking human, understood that the science had to be used with caution. And this is particularly important in terms of the historical context. And this is something I've been thinking about even more after all these years of having thought about Leopold. But he's writing in the years right after World War II. And the key thing of that is those were years, obviously, of disorientation in terms of our relations with other humans, obviously, but also with the land. And most importantly, we had seen a whole raft of new technologies unleashed on the world. powerful technologies that affected the way humans lived on land. And so there's a real strong thread in all these later writings of Leopold of caution about technology unmoored from ethics, applied science, but applied blindly. No, we need ethics to help guide the way we use our knowledge. And so it is very much a book of its time in that sense. It could not have been written before World War II in the same way. Had he lived a little bit longer and learned about things like DNA, just to choose an example, he might have written it a little differently. So it is a book of its moment, but there are certain elements of it, like those lines that I just read, that really withstand a lot of the changes that have happened since.
Just a quick add on to that, Diane. I mean, the other thing that I've really come to appreciate is that the book also couldn't have been written prior to World War II, because it was World War II and his sons and his students off at war that gave him time to actually sit down and write. And so he had this space in his calendar now, as he'd been musing on these things, to actually put pen to paper and start to work some of this through. And now, I mean, it's a book of its time, as Curt said, but when we think about things that are happening in Europe and Asia, I mean, the war backdrop actually is pretty apropos for some of the things the world is continuing to experience, and the role and way technology continues to drive society. So some of the language, I think, at times kind of feels dated to readers, but I think the concepts really are timeless, and kind of continue to provide insights and inspiration about how we should rethink our relationships.
Yeah, Buddy, actually, can you talk a little bit more about how that happens on the ground at the Leopold Foundation or with, your partners or programs?
Well, I think, again, what Leopold was great at was bridging the practice and the theory, and kind of living in that moment of that kind of creative tension of where things are at now and where we want them to be. And so I think the work of the foundation continues to explore that. We continue to do ecological restoration and management with the best knowledge and insights to conserve threatened species and grassland ecosystems. But then we try to pose questions for ourselves and our community about what is our relationship to technology, to each other, to the natural world, and catalyze those kind of conversations that spark our imagination and rethink and re-envision different future possibilities from where we stand right now. So I think that's how we do it. And it's a very collaborative approach, again, with with scholars, with practitioners, with just citizens that want to be out there volunteering and making the world better wherever they can in whatever way they can.
Yeah, it seemed like that was especially a big thing for Leopold as well, was he was writing, it seemed like just because he wanted to put his thoughts down, but he also wanted to encourage people to see their world in a different way, a way that took him some time to see as well. Roberta, I wonder how you see the philosophy sort of playing a role in shaping environmental policies and public attitudes in this day and age.
Yeah, good. I actually think there's a lot to be learned from Leopold. I mean, one is that he asked why, right? He wanted to. He wasn't like, we should do this, but why should we do it? Why should we act in these ways? And I think that's something that we do as philosophers. We ask that why question. And as I look at policy conversations, they don't always ask the why question. They go right to, let's do this, let's do this, let's do this. But why? And the why question matters, because you answer it one way, that'll dictate one course of action, but you answer it a different way, it dictates a different course of action. And so Leopold is telling us, like, take something like climate change, when we try to grapple with it, that we can't just think of ourselves as humans, that we have to think of our whole land community. And that does change, right? That certain actions that we might conceivably use to combat climate change, won't really make sense unless, we take into account the whole land community. So I think that why question, and then also too, one of the things, I was at a conference over the weekend that actually was talking about this very question, like what can philosophers say to policy? And I talked about Leopold, and I kind of said, like, look, let's learn from the way that he did policy, and he did it in this very he recognized that there's all these different interests that come to any kind of decision about the land, and we want to see how we can harmonize them. We want to see how they can cooperate instead of compete. And again, I think that was very forward thinking for the time. I mean, just the fact that he was a scientist talking about values, right? So, kind of thinking forward and thinking, how can we bring all these interests to the table, but they have to have a commitment to the common enterprise, and that is the health of the land, right? So this is, I guess, to me, my role as a philosopher is to just try to, he laid things out so beautifully. I can't hope to, echo his prose, but what I can do as a philosopher is try to lay things out clearly. So, and so that's, I try to sort of identify, like, here are the principles that I see him embodying when he did policy. So.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I'm going to get to some questions from our audience in just a moment. I want to mention this comment that Annie just put in. Sorry, Curt, we're going to obscure you for just a moment while we put this up on the screen. Annie says, one thing I learned from reading Leopold and about him as a young person is that one can be wrong and learn from it and grow. That shaped my decision to study environmental and earth science. I think that's amazing. And I think, Roberta, you've probably seen a lot of people who are taking classes in environmental studies and in philosophy, kind of playing with this idea, but not sure what they're going to do. And do you think that reading Leopold sort of helps push more people towards that, I think I will become something, an environmental something?
Yeah, very much so. And that to that point of that question, I think that's one of the things that makes Leopold's ideas so attractive, is that he's not this sort of perfect figure who knew everything from the beginning. He's somebody who made mistakes and who learned from the mistakes, and seeing that change, I think really appeals to people. And they think, okay, I'm not a perfect person either, but I can learn, and I can think, and I can reflect. And I think, people find the land ethic really exciting. My students certainly found it really exciting when they learned about it, because it I don't know, it just seemed sensible to them. Was, as I taught, like, all the different topics, the Leopold section was always the one that students got the most excited about, because they could see it being put into practice and see the sense of it. So yeah, I think it is something that's very engaging.
Just again, kind of building on that, I mean, I think especially with the environmental conservation challenges and crises that we see today, I mean, Roberta referenced climate change. Well, climate change is really something to be against, right? It's like rear guard action, and how do we mitigate ill effects? The land ethic, a conservation ethic, is something to be for. Like, he puts you in an empowered position to make the world better, not just do no harm. It's like, how can we be active agents of positive change? And so I think that's what's also still resonant for those that have this commitment to service, is like, I want to make the world better. And here's somebody who's helping me think about that, or at least is on the same journey that I want to be on.
That's a really good point, buddy. Yeah.
Well, Curt, you were one of those young people who found about Leopold's work, and you, like I mentioned in our introduction, you worked with Leopold's descendants to actually write the first biography about his life and work. How did that experience change you?
Well, it took up my 20s, I can tell you that. Well, it's a really interesting question, and I don't pause to reflect on it much because there's too much work to keep doing. But, I was in my 20s, and I was in the position of those young people that Buddy and Roberta were just talking about. I was learning about climate change in the early 1980s. Come on, we knew we had a problem coming at us. We knew the biodiversity challenges were before us, and on and on. And I decided to do my graduate work on Leopold because, in part, I saw, even with just a little cursory research, that Leopold's story could help me ground myself in history. That learning about him, I was not just learning about him as an individual. I was learning about the community and culture that produced him. I was learning about the historical realities that he grew out of. I was learning things that he missed and could see where he had missed things, but also where he had really been quite prescient. And in a time, especially in the 1980s, was another period of intense politicization of a lot of these issues, and was kind of a refuge from being in the momentary, ephemeral politics of the day, to step back from all that and put it all into some kind of perspective. And when I took on the writing of the biography, that was what I hoped to do for readers, even though I had no experience being a writer at that point at all. But saying, wow, this story can be really helpful in, again, helping us to think through things and helping to inform us in terms of the evolution of the science and the policy and the ideas. And plus, it was a great story. And Leopold, as I mentioned earlier, and the thing that really distinguishes him as a human is this capacity for continual growth through his family, through his experiences, through his landscapes, and all of that just made for a fascinating study of the human condition, right? But for me, I often think about this. It's pretty weird when you're in your 20s to write a biography of someone. You haven't had enough life experience yourself to make sense of it. And you go through this bizarre experience of living a life vicariously, right? You get born, you live, you learn stuff, and you die. So it was a very strange experience in that sense, but it was also one that in ways was liberating, because it did take you out of your own kind of frame of reference and put you into a larger reality and a narrative.
Yeah, it sounds like a really true, I mean, it's a formative experience in so much as it led you here with all of us today, which I'm excited that you did that.
And let me just
Um,
very quickly add one word here, that
yeah.
my highest priority was to provide that narrative in a way that others could pick up on. And that was really what I was hoping. So it's immensely rewarding when Roberta comes along, or many of the other scholars who I've had a chance to work with and spend time with, they're able to, for me, this was a long time ago. I've gone on to do many other things in my conservation career. But to be able to see how others, push back against what I did, build on it, extend it, elaborate it, it's quite rewarding.
Well, this is my chance then to say how extremely helpful your book was to me, and I just loved it from cover to cover, right? Just the perspective you give and the detail, and I find myself going back time and time again. What was this time period? This, philosopher brain, I don't always remember those things. So I love your book. So thank you for writing it in your 20s.
Well, thanks. I go back to it too, and I'd say, who was the guy who wrote that book?
Well, we've got some great questions from our audience, and I'm going to elevate some of them here. Continuing just talking about sort of what it was, what Leopold was living through. One of our listeners asks, what oppositions did he face? Maybe there were extractive industries that were exploiting the environment that were opposed to his writing, or other people or politics. Curt, can you give us a little bit of a perspective to start on sort of what he was up against in his time?
I'll kick it off, but I'd really like to hear Roberta and Buddy also weigh in here. Yeah, Leopold was one of the fascinating tensions in his life is between Leopold as an idealist and Leopold as a pragmatist, right? Leopold was very high-minded when it came to his own conservation interests, goals, values, but he was also engaged in the realities of the modern economy, political system, whatever. So he's his study and constant tacking back and forth between his pragmatism and his idealism. There's a dozen different issues we could talk about: protecting wilderness, or advocating for allowing predators to remain on the landscape, or how we deal with the powerful economic forces that drive our capitalist society, right? So in all those and many others you can mention, he was always weighing how can he make a difference, and actually make it happen, and not just talk about it or write about it even or think about it, but he wanted to see his ideas make a difference in the world. So I find that just it was one of those uh, threads in his life that it's a biographer's dream in a sense, because it really helps to show the drama of his life.
Amazing. Roberta, what about you? Was there any other sort of places of opposition that you noticed as you were rereading about Leopold and his work and then translating it for our modern life?
Yeah, I think, as somebody who engaged in policy, right? I think he had to be practical a lot of the time. He had to make compromises, but while still keeping the ideal, as Curt said. And so, kind of recognizing that, humans are, have certain needs, and those are important too. And so, how to balance those human needs and human interests with, again, the health of the land more broadly, and kind of recognizing those are really in some sense one and the same, but there's the short-term interest and the long-term interest. And so trying to persuade people to see the long view, to think about the health of the land while still recognizing and having to make compromises sometimes about people's particular interests.
Yeah, I'm sure it was lots of competing perspectives that he had to think about while doing his own writing. Oh, there's so many good questions. I'm having trouble picking them. So Eugene actually has a great question. Curt, I'll pose it to you first, and then I'll bring it to our other experts. What things did Aldo miss? I wonder if we can sort of talk about this in two ways as well. What did he miss during his lifetime that maybe you wish you had his perspective on? But also, when he passed away in 1948, what did he miss in so much as, like, what would you have been excited for him to see and write about in the years after his passing?
Yeah, boy, what a great question. Um, we should have gone to the other two here so I could ponder it a little bit longer. But um, well, I'll try to do this quickly. But in his own lifetime, things he missed. Well, Leopold was a product of his own society. He was a white male and living a life of relative privilege in his own society, and so his attention to issues of justice, his understanding of the greater realities that we are now so much more aware of, he missed some of that. Not all of that. He was very progressive and thoughtful in many different areas, and so he didn't live, as I mentioned earlier, to see scientific advances, like I mentioned DNA, but we can think of 100 other things. He didn't realize that the climate crisis was looming. He kind of had an intuition on that. He didn't live to see the civil rights movement. He didn't know who Martin Luther King was. He did not live to see the renaissance of indigenous American culture and life and language. So this is all important because you can't talk about land without talking about the complex histories and human relationships on, with, and within the land. There are obviously advances in the science of ecology that he would not have been aware of, and that there's been a lot of really interesting scholarship on over the years of what he did actually intuit and get. And Roberta has really helped us understand in a new way some of that. So he missed a lot, but he didn't. But he was also had an amazingly accurate intuition on a lot of these things, because, and it goes back to what Buddy and Roberta were talking about earlier. Often we get the questions, and all of us have probably had them, Buddy and Roberta, of what would Leopold have said about this or that. My standard answer is I don't answer that question. But what I can tell you is how he thought about this or that issue, how he thought about complexity. And so even if he didn't have all the experience and knowledge and historical events to draw on, the way he thought helped guide him, and it continues to be useful as you learn about his work.
Thanks, Curt. Buddy, what about you? Are there things that you think that Leopold missed during his
Well,
lifetime?
I
You would
don't
have
think I
loved.
can sum that up better than Curt did. I think he did a great job. And again, his ability to intuit things like the importance of biodiversity and scale and connectivity, and just ecosystem services, I think are really amazing. But one of the things we point to, kind of again, back to where Leopold put his hands right in the dirt, is the family planted almost 50,000 pine trees over the time period from 1935 to 1948. And if we were going to do an ecological restoration project from scratch today, we would hardly plant any pine trees on this same landscape. But again, he was working with the primary issue was soil erosion due to just exposed sand, and pine trees were free, given out by the state. He was trying to do this project on a budget with 5 kids, and that was the labor force. So, there are actually things in his practice where his practice wasn't as far ahead as his theory and philosophy, but he was working within what he had. And now the Leopold Foundation, where those pine trees are, our goal is to keep those pine trees there forever. And so that there will be old growth pine trees that people can come see, that Aldo and Estella and the 5 kids planted right there in the same spot. So there's these, this is the other thing that Leopold really couldn't have fully appreciated, the interaction between ecological and cultural values, and how these things are playing out, and how much more knowledge and sophistication we have now that was not available to Leopold and his colleagues.
Yeah, and you've displayed how conservation and preservation are kind of always in flux, and that it changes depending on what the goals are for the specific area, the place, the tree sometimes. And so, these things are complex. And he definitely as well sort of, talks about that in his book. Roberta, is there anything else that we missed as part of this conversation that you'd like to add?
I guess this maybe goes along with what Curt was saying, but that, and I bring this up because a lot of people ask me about it, sort of what's the connection between Leopold's views and the views of many indigenous peoples. And I think it's, Curt and I have talked about this. It's a really difficult question to answer. You're sort of piecing together little, historical bits of evidence. So, but I find it really interesting to think about possible connections. It's not really, I feel like it's not for me to say what they are. That's, I think, maybe a role for indigenous scholars to say, and some have said how they feel about it. But just sort of knowing more, what his influences were there would be something that I wish I knew, because as I said, the potential connections between things like interdependence on the one hand and reciprocity on the other hand, I think are, really kind of interesting to think about.
I found this constant sort of like balancing act in Leopold's work too, right? Like he was talking about sort of getting back to the land, and then talking about like conservation being self-defeating. And so it's like he was sort of doing this back and forth a lot, and I don't blame him, because I often feel this way too, of like, we just got to let the land do its thing, but also if we don't help, it can't do its thing. And so it's like I posed this question to our community members as well, and so I'm wondering, do you agree with this desire to conserve with minimal interference? Do you think it's possible in our modern world? Curt, I'll go to you first.
Oh, that's such a great question. That's a whole lecture to answer. Think of it this way. Leopold was a product of that early conservation movement that we associate with Teddy Roosevelt. And for those of you who are a little more into it, Gifford Pinchot, his chief forester. And so he inherited a conservation movement that was actually riven between 2 different ways of thinking, one of protection and preservation, and the other of what's called sustainable use, or more utilitarian approach to conservation, of using resources, albeit wisely. Well, Leopold inherits that tension, and he works all his life to resolve it. He tries and struggles, and over the years keeps going back and forth trying to say these are not incompatible. And then he adds a third leg too, and Buddy mentioned it starting in the early 1930s, amid the Dust Bowl years, right? The worst environmental disaster that European culture had ever experienced anyway on the American landscape. And out of that comes a new field that he also helped develop of ecological restoration, which is neither preservation nor wise exploitation. It's something different. It's about restoring diversity, function, health, ecosystem services, all those modern terms we use. So again, it's Leopold living through a tension, and out of that tension, creating something new, different, and forward-looking.
Roberta, I'll go to you next. What do you think? Is it sort of possible to have minimal interference at this point? And do you think that how do you think he'd feel sort of in this modern context?
Well, I guess minimal interference. I'm trying to decide if I think that he did want minimal interference.
So this is my interpretation of his writing, right? I've read this twice now, and so I'm sure you've read his work much more than me. So I'm excited to hear your interpretation as well.
Well, I think what I read him as saying is that we are going to make changes as humans, but that they should be slow and local and not extreme, right? But what is that? That's based on what he's seen, again, as we talked about, right? Based on his experience where he's seen humans make very drastic changes, they tend to go bad, right? So that's why we need to be slow and careful. But then, as you said before, Diana, he also did, and Buddy talked about, right, the restoration on his farm, and that's a very active, engagement. And so I feel like he was always very cautious in saying, there's so many things we don't know, and so he didn't want to act too rashly, because again, he had made mistakes in the past and didn't want us to make them again. But I think anyone can see that when there's a crisis, and I think he would have seen, where there's a crisis situation, maybe you do have to take more of that active role as he saw sometimes was necessary.
Buddy, is there anything we're missing or anything that the
foundation? I don't know how to add to this, but I'll try. I think what Roberta was saying is that it's irrefutable that we've seen where people can make land unhealthy. And then if you read Song of the Gavilan, Leopold talks about indigenous cultures that had been there for time immemorial, and there were artifacts and landscape modifications, and yet he called that the healthiest land he had ever seen in his life. So we can see the range of realities that people can have on the landscape, and yet what we know is also irrefutable is that people need healthy land to be healthy. So I think that opens up the discussion and the prescription about where and how we intervene, always trying not to intervene in the way that leads to land sickness or land pathology, as he called it one time. And so what are the range of ways, again, that I think Leopold was looking to empower people? Like, how do we live our lives in a way that is rich and full and healthy? That's what we should gravitate towards. Anything else, that's a problem. So, but sometimes that might mean planting 50,000 pine trees to get the soil to stay there and to regenerate. That's pretty significant intervention, really, at that point in time.
Yeah,
that's a really good way of putting it, Buddy. Thank you.
We've got time for just one more question from our audience, and I'm going to pose this one from Jeff, which reads, as a forward-thinking educator, how do we best connect the TikTok generation or young people to the land ethic? Curt, do you have any advice for connecting young people to the land ethic?
Go outside, turn off the phone.
It's simple advice, but I feel like it's really good advice.
And it doesn't matter where you are, whether you're in a remote area or in an urban environment. It doesn't matter. There's always something to observe and pay attention to and to care about. And the distractions of, again, it's a modern technology. I'll very quickly mention, I got an email recently from a colleague who wanted to know if I'd help her develop a proposal on research to look at artificial intelligence and the land ethic. I said, well, that's a fascinating new way of thinking about it. But yeah, it's just Leopold is the one reason the book holds on after all these decades is because he's showing people how to see and how to understand and how to sit back and allow your own five senses to be connected with the world. And he's inspired so many other writers and thinkers and scientists and so forth to do that. So yeah, try to tune out the distractions as best you can, if it's only for half an hour a day, and rely on your own native capacities.
This is the only time I've ever seen our watcher count go down a little bit and been like, oh, that's so nice. Some people already are listening to Curt and taking his advice. I love that. Buddy, what about you?
Well, all right. As a father of three, I'll go a half step towards where Curt was. Just take them out and let them use the phone as the tool to observe, right? Like take photos, ask questions. But to Curt's point, engage the out of doors. And if you can't get them to put it down for a while, like, I get my kids out and they stay out longer with me if they get to use it periodically or take a photo or look something up. So not all technology is bad. It's just how we deploy it. And so just watching TikTok videos for new tennis shoes like that we could do better than that. So that would be my slight modification.
I love that. I think they're both really good pieces of advice. Roberta, what about you?
Well, yeah, I love Curt's and Buddy's advice as well. So maybe I'll just try and throw out another suggestion, which is that, there's, of course, a long history of wonderful nature shows. And, those can be brought to TikTok as well, right? So maybe it's up to us or others who, who love the land to go out with our phones and video ourselves and show people what we're seeing. And try to engage them, kind of engage them where they are. I think Curt said this, right? It doesn't have to be, a grand national park. It could be, your little park down the corner and some trees and some squirrels and some grass. And what do you hear and what do you see? And what's, just the way in Sand County Almanac, the way Leopold makes a story out of everything, right? That, all the animals and even the plants and the trees, right, have all their interests and what they're trying to do and what they're thinking about, right? So if we could use TikTok videos and similar things to tell stories like that and then encourage people, come outside and make one of these yourself,
And a quick shameless plug, read a Sand County Almanac. That's the beauty of the book, is you can just read 2 pages and you get something out of it.
Yes.
And you can read it aloud and share that moment. And it doesn't have to be a long homework assignment. You got to read the whole book and write a dissertation, a doorstop book like Curt's. Just read it and think about it for a moment.
I will say I don't tend to highlight in books anymore. If I highlighted things in books, I would highlight the entire book and it would just be a useless function. But I loved reading and highlighting a Sand County Almanac. There were just so many moments and pieces of writing that I was like, that is how I feel, and didn't know how to put it into words. So yeah, buddy, you're showing off your copy right now.
So when so this is many years ago now, when the Green Fire documentary just came out, and Curt actually came to UC Davis. And Curt, I think that was maybe when I first met you. And all these people showed up to the event, and they were carrying their copies of Sand County Almanac with them. And this is embarrassing. I don't have any tabs coming out of mine, but they all did. And it was wonderful. It was just this wonderful event, and seeing the Green Fire documentary was really fabulous. And if other folks out there haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend it.
Well, thank you all so much for being here. I have one more question before we go back outside, because I don't know about you, but that's where I'm headed after this. So the book that we are reading, the edition that we are reading, is a Sand County Almanac and sketches here and there, which also includes sort of a third section called The Upshot, which features really his essays about the land ethic. And so a Sand County Almanac, though, is written in these month chapters of his experience out on the farm that he bought and was learning to restore with his family. I wonder, do you have a favorite month that you like to revisit and reread, either during that month or when it's useful for you to revisit it? Buddy, I'll start with you this time. What do you think?
Well, I would say whatever month we're in would be my favorite. But I would also, I'll just share this for those, the Nina Leopold, who was my mentor and a daughter of Aldo and Estella Leopold. Her favorite essay was from November, If I Were the Wind. So I will just share that as a special essay.
It's a good one to read this month as well.
Yeah.
Roberta, what do you think? Favorite month from the
Yeah, it's a really good question. They're all so wonderful. I don't know, maybe it's because I was born in January, but I actually really like the January one, even though it's short, because the way I think I kind of alluded to this before, like it brings you in. You're just telling this story about, here's this path that a skunk has made, and here's a bird that crosses it, and yet what he's doing in that story, it's so wonderful, and it's very subtle. Is he's saying, like, look, they all have their plans, their goals, their intentions. The bird, the mouse is an engineer, and he's constructing his his paths, and but there's a January thaw, and so now all his tunnels are exposed. And I don't know, to me it just brings you into this whole idea of the land is a community, is your community, in such a subtle way, right? Just here are these actors, right? And doing their thing. And I just love how engaging it is and how subtle it is, that right from the beginning of the book, right, he's bringing us into this idea of the land being our community.
Last but certainly not least, Curt, what do you think?
Well, they did give me time to really leaf through my table contents here, and I had 6 of them by the time Roberta finished. But I'll choose this one to make a point. Another of the November essays is called A Mighty Fortress. And it's an interesting little essay to read because it's all about, as Leopold calls them, his disease-ridden woods, right?
Yes.
How, as an ecologist, you look at a woods and where others may see destruction and death and disease, he sees wonderful interactions playing out in a degraded woodlot. And it makes a point that I think fascinating to ponder. And Diana, you mentioned how many lines you highlighted. One of the really interesting ironies of Sand County Almanac is that Leopold's ability as a prose writer, this poetic, lyrical prose that can overwhelm you line by line, it's written about a degraded piece of plain old Midwestern worn out farmland. This is not John Muir in the High Sierras. This is not, a grand scenic landscape that conservation is always associated with. This is about a degraded place with a really troubled history, right? And yet he makes it appealing. And it speaks to a word we haven't used yet in this whole conversation, that is beauty. And how, for all the intellectual content and all the analytical power of Leopold, is also ability to tap into our raw human appreciation of beauty. Also keeps the book relevant through all the changes and challenges that we have experienced and will be experiencing going forward.
What a beautiful way to end. Thank you so much, Curt. I appreciate, and Buddy and Roberta, thank you all so much for being here, for being a part of this conversation and taking some time to chat with our book club members. So thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you, Diana, for the invitation, and to all of you for reading.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I appreciate the listeners, right, wanting to engage. It's great.
Yeah, me as well. I mean, we have a great community, and thank you all so much for coming out for today's live stream. You can find out everything you need to know about Science Fridays Book Club at sciencefriday.com/book club. It's very easy to find us. And I'll just quickly plug next month's book, which is Crossings by Ben Goldfarb. I see everyone nodding. It's a continuation of our talk about ecology, specifically about road ecology. It's one of my favorite books from last year. So I hope you will join us and continue the conversation next month. Abby, Roberta, Curt, thank you again, and we'll see you all soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
I know.